Johnny Cash recorded an entire album about Native American genocide. Nashville tried to bury it, radio stations banned it, and his own label sabotaged his career to silence him. August 1964, Columbia Records headquarters, New York City. Johnny Cash walked into the executive conference room carrying a master tape that he believed would become the most important album of his career. He was about to play Bitter Tears, Ballads of the American Indian, for the men who controlled his destiny, the men who decided which of his songs would reach the airwaves and which would disappear into obscurity. For more powerful, untold stories about Johnny Cash and the Man in Black's hidden legacy, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to reveal these important stories that shaped music history. Johnny had no idea he was walking into an ambush. He had no idea that the album he'd poured his heart and soul into would be treated like a disease that needed to be contained. He had no idea that speaking truth about the systematic destruction of Native American peoples would make him an enemy of the very industry that had made him rich and famous. To understand what happened to Johnny Cash in 1964, you need to understand what America looked like that year. And you need to understand how completely the entertainment industry was committed to maintaining a version of American history that was comfortable, sanitized, and profitable for white audiences. This was 1964, the height of the civil rights movement. But while America was beginning to confront its treatment of Black Americans, the suffering of Native Americans remained largely invisible, ignored, and deliberately forgotten. The reservation system had effectively removed Native Americans from public consciousness, out of sight, out of mind, and certainly out of popular music. Country music in 1964 was particularly resistant to social consciousness. It was music for white, conservative, patriotic audiences who wanted to hear songs about trucks, heartbreak, and simple pleasures. The last thing country music executives wanted was an artist using their platform to remind Americans about genocide, broken treaties, and the ongoing poverty and discrimination faced by Native peoples. But Johnny Cash had always been different from other country artists. He'd grown up poor, he'd felt marginalized, and he had an instinctive sympathy for anyone who had been crushed by systems too big and too powerful for individuals to fight. More than that, Johnny had been deeply influenced by the folk music movement, which was addressing social issues that mainstream country music refused to touch. The inspiration for Bitter Tears had come from an unlikely source, Peter Lafarge, a Native American folk singer and activist who had been trying for years to get mainstream artists to pay attention to Native American issues. Lafarge had written songs about the reality of reservation life, about broken treaties, about the systematic destruction of Native cultures, but he couldn't get radio play, couldn't get record deals, couldn't get anyone in the music industry to take him seriously. In early 1964, Lafarge had approached Johnny with a collection of songs he'd written, hoping that Johnny's star power could bring attention to issues that had been ignored for generations. Johnny listened to Lafarge's songs and was immediately struck by their power, their honesty, and their heartbreaking relevance to problems that most Americans pretended didn't exist. One song in particular grabbed Johnny's attention, the Ballad of Ira Hayes. It told the story of Ira Hayes, a Pima Indian who had been one of the 6 men who raised the American flag at Iwo Jima during World War II, one of the most iconic images in American history. But the song didn't celebrate Hayes as a hero. Instead, it told the tragic story of what happened to him after the war, how he returned to a reservation where his people were living in poverty, how he struggled with alcoholism and depression, how he died forgotten and broken at the age of 32. Johnny was fascinated and horrified by Ira Hayes' story. Here was a man who had literally helped create one of America's most patriotic symbols, but who had been abandoned by the country he'd served. Hayes had fought for American freedom, while his own people were denied basic rights, had risked his life for a flag that represented a government that had systematically destroyed his culture and confined his people to barren reservations. Johnny decided not just to record Lafarge's song about Ira Hayes, but to make an entire album addressing Native American issues. He would use his platform, his voice, his credibility to shine a light on problems that had been kept in the dark for too long. The album Johnny created was unlike anything in country music history. Bitter Tears contained 8 songs, each addressing different aspects of the Native American experience. There were songs about the Trail of Tears, about broken treaties, about the poverty and alcoholism that plagued reservation communities, about the systematic destruction of Native cultures and languages. But these weren't abstract political statements. Johnny had done his research, had talked to Native Americans, had visited reservations, had seen firsthand the conditions that most Americans never knew existed. The songs were specific, personal, and devastatingly honest about America's treatment of its indigenous peoples. When Johnny played the album for Columbia Records executives in August 1964, the reaction was immediate and hostile. "Johnny," said Don Law, his longtime producer, "this isn't what your fans want to hear." "How do you know what my fans want to hear?" "Because I know your audience. They're conservative, patriotic, traditional. They don't want to be lectured about social problems. They want entertainment." Johnny's voice was calm but determined. "Don, this is entertainment. This is storytelling. This is American history set to music." "This is political activism disguised as music," interrupted another executive. "This is the kind of material that could damage your career, damage your relationship with radio stations, damage your standing with the people who buy your records." Johnny looked around the room at the faces of men who controlled his access to the American public. "So you're saying I should ignore injustice because it might be bad for business?" "I'm saying you should stick to what you do best," Law replied. "Love songs, train songs, prison songs, the material that made you famous." "Don, do you know who Ira Hayes was?" Law looked uncomfortable. "Johnny, that's not the point." "That's exactly the point. Ira Hayes helped raise the flag at Iwo Jima. He's in one of the most famous photographs in American history. He fought for this country, and this country forgot about him. If that's not a story worth telling, what is?" The meeting went on for 2 hours, with Johnny arguing passionately for the importance of the album and the executives arguing just as passionately for him to shelve it, or at least to remove the most controversial songs. Finally, Columbia agreed to release the album, but with conditions. They would do minimal promotion, they would press limited copies, and they would not push radio stations to play the songs. In essence, they would release Bitter Tears, but hope it would disappear quickly and quietly. Johnny agreed to these terms because he believed the music would speak for itself. He believed that once people heard these songs, once they learned these stories, they would demand more. He believed that truth was more powerful than corporate resistance. Johnny Cash had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Bitter Tears was released in September 1964, and the industry reaction was swift and brutal. Country radio stations refused to play the songs. Pop stations wouldn't touch them. Even folk music stations, which were supposed to be sympathetic to social justice causes, largely ignored the album. The reasons given were always the same: too political, too controversial, not right for our audience. But Johnny suspected the real reason was simpler and more disturbing. America didn't want to confront the truth about its treatment of Native Americans. The song that received the most resistance was "The Ballad of Ira Hayes," which Johnny had expected to be a hit. It was brilliantly written, emotionally powerful, and told the story of a genuine American hero who had been forgotten and abandoned. But radio programmers treated it like poison. Johnny started making phone calls to radio stations, trying to understand why they wouldn't play the song. "It's too depressing," one program director told him. "Our listeners don't want to hear about alcoholic Indians dying in ditches." "But Ira Hayes was a war hero," Johnny protested. "He fought at Iwo Jima." "Johnny, look, I respect what you're trying to do, but this kind of material just doesn't work on country radio. Stick to the songs that made you famous." Johnny tried another station. "The song is too political," the program director there explained. "We don't play protest songs." "It's not a protest song. It's a biography set to music." "Johnny, anything that makes America look bad is political. Our listeners love this country. They don't want to hear about how we mistreated the Indians." "But we did mistreat them. We're still mistreating them." "That's not for us to decide, Johnny. That's for politicians and historians. We just play music." Station after station gave Johnny similar responses. The pattern became clear. The music industry was actively suppressing Bitter Tears, not because the songs weren't good, but because they were too good, too powerful, too effective at making people uncomfortable with truths they preferred to ignore. But Johnny wasn't willing to accept defeat. If the industry wouldn't support the album, he would fight for it himself. In October 1964, Johnny did something unprecedented in country music. He took out a full-page advertisement in Billboard magazine, the most important music industry publication in America. The ad was unlike anything ever seen in Billboard. Instead of promoting a hit song or announcing tour dates, Johnny used the space to challenge the entire music industry. He wrote an open letter asking why radio stations were refusing to play "The Ballad of Ira Hayes," challenging programmers to explain their resistance to a song about a genuine American hero. The ad was bold, confrontational, and completely outside the normal rules of how country music artists were supposed to behave. Artists didn't publicly challenge radio stations. Artists didn't buy advertisements to complain about lack of airplay. Artists certainly didn't accuse the industry of suppressing important music for political reasons. The response to Johnny's Billboard ad was immediate and devastating. Instead of shaming radio stations into playing the song, the ad made Johnny even more of a pariah. Program directors who had been politely declining to play "The Ballad of Ira Hayes" now actively blacklisted Johnny's music. Some stations stopped playing his older hits. Some promoters canceled scheduled concerts. Some music journalists who had always supported Johnny began writing negative articles, questioning his judgment and his loyalty to country music traditions. Columbia Records was furious about the Billboard ad. Executives called Johnny into meetings, demanding that he apologize, that he back down. that he returned to recording safe, commercial material. "Johnny," Don Law told him in a heated phone conversation, "you're destroying your career over a cause that nobody cares about. Indian rights? Really? That's the hill you want to die on?" "Don, Ira Hayes died for this country. The least I can do is tell his story." Ira Hayes was an alcoholic who couldn't adjust to civilian life. That's not uncommon among veterans. It's not a political statement about Indian rights. Johnny was shocked by Law's dismissive attitude. "Don, Ira Hayes came back from the war to a reservation where his people were living in poverty, where they had no opportunities, where they were treated like second-class citizens. He fought for freedom overseas while his own people were denied basic rights at home. If that's not political, what is?" "That's ancient history, Johnny. The Indian Wars ended decades ago. These people need to move on, assimilate, become productive members of society." Johnny realized he was having a conversation with someone who fundamentally didn't understand or care about the issues he was trying to address. More disturbing, he realized that Law's attitude was representative of the entire music industry. They weren't just resistant to social consciousness, they were actively hostile to it. The commercial failure of Bitter Tears was devastating to Johnny's career. The album sold poorly, radio play virtually disappeared, and concert attendance dropped significantly. Johnny was learning the hard way that there were real costs to challenging the system, even when you were rich and famous. But the personal cost was even higher. Johnny had put his heart and soul into Bitter Tears, had believed passionately in its importance, had thought he was using his platform to speak for people who had no voice. The industry's rejection of the album felt like a rejection of Johnny himself, of his values, of his understanding of what music could and should do. Johnny began drinking more heavily during this period, struggling with depression and self-doubt. He started questioning whether he belonged in the music business, whether he should continue trying to make music that mattered, whether he should just give the industry what it wanted and stop trying to change the world. June Carter, who would later become Johnny's wife, was one of the few people in the music industry who supported Bitter Tears. She understood what Johnny was trying to do, understood why it mattered, and understood the courage it had taken for him to risk his career for his principles. "Johnny," June told him during one of his darkest moments, "you did the right thing, even if nobody else understands it, even if it costs you everything. You told the truth about something important." "But nobody's listening, June. The album is a failure. Radio won't play it. Fans aren't buying it. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there's no place for this kind of music." June looked Johnny in the eye. "Johnny, the fact that they're trying so hard to silence you proves how important your message is. If the songs didn't matter, they wouldn't be scared of them." June was right, though it would take years for Johnny to understand the full impact of what he had done. Bitter Tears didn't become a commercial success, but it did something more important. It established Johnny Cash as an artist who was willing to use his platform for social justice, who was willing to risk everything to speak truth to power, who was willing to sacrifice profit for principle. The album also had an impact that went far beyond its sales figures. Other artists, particularly in the folk music community, took notice of what Johnny had done. Bob Dylan, who was just emerging as a major voice in protest music, cited Bitter Tears as an influence. Joan Baez performed songs from the album at her concerts. Native American activists began using Johnny's songs in their own organizing efforts. Most importantly, Bitter Tears opened up a conversation about Native American issues that had been suppressed for decades. The album didn't create a mass movement, but it did plant seeds that would eventually grow into the broader Native American rights movement of the 1970s. Johnny continued to face resistance from the music industry for years after Bitter Tears. His next several albums received minimal promotion from Columbia Records, radio play remained limited, and he was frequently advised to stay in his lane and avoid controversial material. But Johnny had learned something important from the experience. Authenticity mattered more than commercial success. Speaking truth was more valuable than making money. And artists had a responsibility to use their voices for something more than entertainment. The vindication for Bitter Tears came slowly, but it did come. In the 1970s, as America began to acknowledge its treatment of Native Americans more honestly, Johnny's album was rediscovered and praised as ahead of its time. Music historians recognize it as one of the first mainstream albums to address Native American issues with honesty and respect. The Ballad of Ira Hayes, the song that radio stations had refused to play in 1964, was eventually recognized as one of Johnny's greatest recordings. It was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, covered by dozens of other artists, and used in documentaries and educational programs about Native American history. In the 1990s, when Johnny was recording his late career albums with producer Rick Rubin, he reflected on Bitter Tears as one of the most important projects of his career. "I'm prouder of that album than almost anything else I've done," Johnny said in an interview. Not because it was commercially successful, it wasn't, but because it said something that needed to be said, and because I didn't back down when the industry tried to silence me. Peter Lafarge, the Native American songwriter who had originally inspired Johnny to make Bitter Tears, died in 1965, just 1 year after the album's release. He never lived to see the album's eventual recognition, never saw how his songs would influence generations of activist musicians, never knew that his collaboration with Johnny Cash had helped break the silence around Native American issues in popular music. But Lafarge's influence lived on through Johnny's willingness to continue addressing social justice issues throughout his career. Bitter Tears established a template that Johnny would follow for the rest of his life, using his platform to speak for the voiceless, risking commercial success for artistic integrity, and refusing to let the music industry dictate what subjects were appropriate for his songs. The music industry's attempt to bury Bitter Tears ultimately failed, but not because of album sales or radio play. It failed because Johnny Cash had proven that one artist, willing to sacrifice everything for his principles, could change the conversation about issues that those in power preferred to ignore. Johnny Cash recorded an album about Native American genocide in 1964. Nashville tried to silence him. Radio stations banned his music, and his own record label sabotaged his career. But 50 years later, Bitter Tears stands as one of the most important protest albums in American music history. And Johnny Cash's courage in making it helped pave the way for generations of artists who understood that music could be a force for social change. The album that the industry tried to bury became Johnny's most enduring statement about the responsibility of artists to speak truth, regardless of the cost. And the man who was punished for addressing injustice became a hero to everyone who believed that music should do more than just entertain. It should also illuminate, educate, and inspire people to create a more just world. Sometimes the most important albums are the ones the industry tries hardest to suppress.